That's down down the street there. You know, by Brookline. It's on Taylor Broadway.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jasper Dent, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of Métis Nation. Just a note that this event is being live streamed, so please be aware of the webcam to your right. I'd also like to take this moment to remind you all to silence your cell phones for the duration of the event. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Challenge to Civilization by Blair Stonechild, published by University of Regina Press. Thank you to Blair for being here tonight and for working with us to create this event. Blair Stonechild is a member of the Muscopheating First Nation in Saskatchewan. He is a residential school survivor and was the first faculty member hired at the First Nations University of Canada in 1976. He's an author of 5 previous books and lives in Regina with his wife Sylvia and 3 adult children. I'll now turn things over to Blair. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Bonjour, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to start with a brief prayer. It's important in these type of contexts, I think. So, Creator, thank you for the gifts of creation, and thank you for this opportunity to learn. Help us in these times of trouble, guide us and keep us safe in the name of all of our relations. Good. Well, I'm so happy to be here. I was telling Jasper that this is my favorite bookstore in the whole province, and I always come here, and so it's nice to be able to have this this thing here. And I was also telling him that when I had my book launch in Regina, I got some good news. It was sent to me by my publicist. It was a release from the McNally bookstore, McNally Robinson's bookstore in Winnipeg, and it says you're one of the top nonfiction bestsellers. So it's happy with that. And I think it's nice to see all of you out. I told my students about this, and I think next time what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell them this is a mandatory requirement to show the person. But anyway, thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk a bit about how this book came about, and it's been a bit of a long, torturous road, and then I'll do a brief reading from it. So first of all, as was mentioned, I started working at the First Nations University in 1976, which is about 47 years ago now. And I have to say that the highlight probably of working there has been being able to work with the elders. And it's because of many years of listening to them and offering them tobacco and asking them for the knowledge that I came up with these books. And I wanted to write something. As a matter of fact, the elders insisted that I write about Indigenous spirituality. They said, these are messages which are important to share. And for example, we have a lot of youth that are off reserve, have lost touch with their culture, and so they said we have to use modern technologies. And I remember I was telling one elder this, and I was just sitting at the table telling him, well, I'm thinking of writing a book. He slammed his fist on the table like that, almost fell off my chair. He says, write it right now, he says. So so I got to work right away. And so the first book was called The Knowledge Seeker, Embracing Indigenous Spirituality. And in that book, what I was trying to do was to have an interpretation of what Indigenous spirituality actually was. And there's a couple of things that I found which I never knew about until I really started asking questions. And I found out that there's a very systematic, belief system that we as Indigenous people share. And it's not just the local Indigenous peoples, but it's virtually unanimous across almost virtually all Indigenous cultures. And in that book, for example, I talk about what I call the great principle, which is that we are spirit beings on a physical journey. That's one of the things which I came about, and there's the idea that there's like the Miwachedowin, like the idea of relationships, that we're here to learn proper relationships, and we're given various types of guidance for those relationships. For example, the grandfather teachings, the 7 grandfather teachings, things like respect and humility and honesty and generosity and all of those things, love and wisdom. And so these type of things are things that because I had gone to residential school, I had never known about, right? All I knew was about the 10 Commandments, and these kinds of directions, what we call the original instructions, are the kind of things that really enabled our societies to be healthy, to be connected spiritually, to be respectful of nature, and to be respectful of the spirit world. And so I wrote that book, and it was well received. Like I was kind of afraid that people might say, oh, this isn't really whatever, right? It's not really worth it. But no, I've been actually quite gratified that even many church groups have invited me to talk about it, and they've been quite receptive about these teachings. And so I hadn't really planned to write anything after that. I thought, well, that's a book which I wanted to write, and I got it done. But then there were some people in the university setting who started to challenge me on it. And in particular, there was one professor who said that I was engaging in what he called educational malpractice, and said that I was talking about pseudo knowledge, which shouldn't be in universities. So that kind of really rubbed me the wrong way, and got me going. And I resolved to answer that by writing another book. And that second book was called Loss of Indigenous Eden and the Fall of Spirituality. And in that book, what I was attempting to do was to try and figure out, where did the differences in thinking begin? The differences in perceptions, thinking, worldview. Where did that start between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people? And so I started to do research, and I began to dig up a bunch of books, particularly books on the rise of civilization. And I began to go through them, and there's one particular thing that I found out that was really like my aha moment. And I don't know if anybody here wants to venture a definition of civilization, what civilization is. I don't know if anybody wants to take a guess. It's very simple. The definition of simple. If you take a look at any book on civilization, it's very simple. So the definition of civilization essentially is when humanity decided to rise up against and take control over nature. That's basically what civilization is about, right? And so you see the beginnings of agriculture and animal husbandry, and like the creation of cities and accumulation of wealth, and of course conflict and warfare and that type of thing. But the thing which put in my mind was what the elders constantly told me. They kept on telling me, we're not the central purpose of creation. We're here as guests of the Creator, so to speak. And the only thing we're supposed to do is we're supposed to take care of our relatives, right? Our natural relatives, the plants and the animals, and treat them with respect. And then he gave us many other things. For example, ceremonies, to help us to remind us who we are, keep us connected to our spirit, remind us of our purpose, and to help us with our healing whenever we went off path, because we weren't perfect, right? We're just like anyone else. Indigenous people had our challenges and sometimes made mistakes. So in looking at that whole phenomenon, I found out that if you go to universities and you take classes and talk to professors, they'll usually say, well, the story of humanity starts about 6,000 years ago with the formation of civilization. And so, what's all that stuff before it, right? Because modern humans have been around for at least 200,000 years, right? So, what's the rest of that stuff? Is it chopped liver or something,
Yeah.
Well, that's it, right? They say either people were primitive, right? Or they didn't have any notion of, any sort of anything in their head, no type of intellectual development or spiritual development or anything. And so, that kind of thing was really sort of answered by that first book, The Knowledge Seeker, which showed that there was indeed a very clear and very unanimous and a very, very sound, sensible belief system, which Indigenous people still have. And I know from having met Indigenous people all over the world that that's a common belief system. This idea that it's important to consider spirit. It's important to consider our relationship with nature, right? And it's important not to act in ways which are oppressive towards others, and all of those type of things. And so, if you take a look at this phenomenon of civilization, people think, well, civilization is so great, people just couldn't wait to to become civilized. But the fact is that civilization really spread essentially, at the point of a sword, virtually. It arose in places like Ur in Mesopotamia and Rome. Around the time that they reach about a population of about 80,000, all of a sudden, the people in these urban centers become aggressive, right? They start to oppress their neighbors, and they start to take over their resources, and they start to force them to become part of their political structure. So this is a certain type of mindset, which which is associated with this idea that humans were somehow entitled to assert ourselves, right? We're somehow entitled to co-opt nature, and we're somehow entitled to dominate others. And this idea of oppressing of Indigenous people, you'll find that articulated in a theory which was by one of the so-called great Greek philosophers called Aristotle. Aristotle had this theory called the theory of natural slavery. And what he concluded, basically, he said, well, look at us Greeks, we're so great, we're so fantastic, we build all these buildings, and we have all of these weapons, and we've developed all these wonderful arts and mathematics and all these kind of things. And so he says, take a look at all these uncivilized, but you can substitute Indigenous people for that, right? And he said, he basically said, well, these people are so much inferior to us, they're almost like animals. So, it's perfectly justifiable for us to enslave them and use them for our own purposes. And that kind of thing has been used, it was used by the Romans. It's been used by, if you go into, what's called social Darwinism, which is what, people like Hitler and stuff subscribe to, right? They basically said, well, there are superior peoples and there are inferior peoples. It's no longer everybody's equal, right? It's the weak versus so-called, the strong versus the so-called weak. And so it wasn't actually until the 1820s that non-Indigenous people actually became the majority of world population. Even if you look in this area in the 1820s, 99.9% of the people on the prairies would have been Indigenous. So it's not that long ago. People kind of think, well, civilization has been here forever, but it hasn't. It's such a very, very recent development. And I can go on and on. If you take a look at banking systems and the creation of international boundaries, a lot of these have only occurred over the last couple of centuries. And interestingly, they occurred almost in lockstep with the colonization and exploitation of Indigenous lands. As these colonizers went all over world, right? They created boundaries, right? So they could define which territories they're taking over. And with banking systems, this was a way for economies to rapidly expand, right? Banks could create money and they could expand the money system 20 times over, and people could, invest. So it's great for, if you're walking into indigenous land and you want a bunch of guys to go in and invest and create business and stuff. It's great to have a bank like that, right? But I guess the thing is, at some point you reach a limit. Like for example today, right? Houses are getting so expensive. Where are all these new resources to exploit, right? Where's all these new things to, businesses to create, right? All of a sudden we're kind of the glass is getting full, right? And in the meantime, there's more and more people, and you've got limited money supply. So what happens? You're getting a situation where it's getting to the point where people can't even afford housing anymore. So that system is not a natural system. Banking is only very recent. That's not. And I point out that Indigenous culture of the Americas existed for tens of thousands of years without money. They didn't need money. So, these are things to think about. These are things that I'm, sort of challenging a bit. So, I don't want to get into a lecture here. I'm just starting to think of all these other things I could say, but let me just say a couple more things. Because I work at universities and I know there are other people here who are kind of into the university thing. One of the things which I've talked about in terms of our knowledge systems is that our knowledge systems were always based on spirituality. Whenever we thought, is there something to do, the first thing we did is we went to the ceremony and we prayed, right? We asked the ancestors or anyone else, we prayed, why should we do this? What good is it? What good is it for future generations? And we would get answers. And so, that's why people, they wonder why we never seem to act very fast, right? It's because that was intentional. That was intentional. We were always very, very careful about making decisions. The other thing I'd point out in terms of, for example, economics, like when you go to university and you take economics, and everybody talks about the banks, right? And they talk about, the GDP, and they talk about the inflation rate, like the percentage of growth, annual growth and stuff like that. And I point out that we had our own economic policy, our own natural resource policy. And that natural resource policy was very simple. It was just to let nature thrive. That's why there were millions of buffalo. That's why there's so many fish in the ocean. When the European fishermen came over, they put a basket in the ocean, they come up with, a bunch of fish. That's why there are billions of passenger pigeons, which could be, they could just, be so easily hunted. And so on and so forth. And nowadays, what percentage of, especially large animals, they say that, it doesn't matter where you look here in North America or if you look in Africa, about 95% of the original populations, let's say back in around 1800, are now gone, right? So that's the result of the economic system and the natural resource policy of civilization. And so our economic policy was simple: just let it thrive, and we knew that was the best for future generations. We knew we had certainty that our future generations could prosper because the resources were there, and we were nurturing them to be even more numerous. So anyway, to come back to my point here, the prevailing intellectual system used in universities in general, in public these days, is what's called the age of reason, right? It's the Enlightenment. I see some people kind of around here. So what the age of reason basically says is, all you need is your mind. You don't need anything except your mind. And there's a lot of European philosophers like Immanuel Kant and a whole bunch of other them who at some point began to say the same thing, and they started to convince the church that it's the human mind that's superior, that's the highest achievement. But that's where the flaw, that's where the mistake occurs, because it's not the highest. It's spirituality that is the highest form of intelligence. And you can call it leaven and you can call it wisdom, right? And so the thinking process, and I simply say to people, Indigenous people could think just as much as anybody else. We can observe just as well, right? We can come to conclusions about everything just as easily as everybody else. But we restrained ourselves. Especially when it came to greed, right? We restrained ourselves, right? It's a very important thing. And sciences in themselves are neutral, but when you have, when you get people who don't have a sound value system, right? Then those sciences become misused, right? And that's what's happening today. A lot of these, scientific, these knowledge systems are being used at universities and are being used for all kinds of things, creating weapons, creating, chemicals, all kinds of stuff that's damaging, and it's because none of it has been sifted through the filter of spirituality, which it should have been. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm starting to pontificate here a bit. Okay, so anyway, this book, so that looked at the past. So this last book, people kind of said, well, why don't you just make it a trilogy, right? Look at the future. So I said, sure, why not? But no, it does make sense though, and the more I thought about it, and I used to talk to Musham Danny, some of you guys may know him. He was a longtime elder up here in Saskatoon, and he was the one who really kind of opened my eyes to a lot of this stuff. And so, we used to talk about all of the ills of the world and the kind of things that need to be done. And it's there's such a loss of understanding of Indigenous culture and Indigenous wisdom and why it was that our way of life made sense, right? We weren't stupid, we were very, very smart, but the problem is none of our knowledge served the purposes of civilization, right? None of it was encouraging people to go out and exploit the resources as fast as they could, or to create fortunes or mass armies and militaries, that type of thing. Our knowledge systems and our teachings went totally against that, and so it was considered to be useless. But we do have to try and change things about. And I do quote one of the prophecies in here that says that non-Indigenous people would come here, right? And they would come to our land, and that at first they would not listen to us, right? That they would they would be doing bad things, but according to the prophecy, that eventually they would listen to us, and that's really the only hope, that if they listen to us, then that's probably the only way that will actually survive. And so there, as I say, there are many changes that need to be made. I talk about stuff like all this technology that's being developed. I mean, it's just really good technology, and what the whole money system. I mean, what's the point, right? Why are we exhausting our resources faster than we can, than we can, possibly do? So of course, I question these things. I question the damages that taking part with nature, like climate change and all that stuff. And so I begin to say, well, what do we do? And what I'll do is I'll read a bit, because I think that what needs to happen is that Indigenous people need to they need to think about making drastic change. And I know a lot of us are involved in education. So what I'll do is I'll read a little bit of the book that talks about education. So this section is called Refocusing Education. It says, reconciling with Indigenous wisdom will be essential to human longevity. So it is imperative that steps be taken to incorporate revised narratives in educational foundations. curriculum development, and teacher training. There also needs to be honesty about the destructiveness of civilization. An authentic curriculum on Indigenous spirituality has yet to be written. There is a need for a new meta-narrative. It's one of those fancy words I learned from somebody that reflects the centrality of spirituality in Indigenous thinking and teaching. Some elements could include the following: Indigenous origin stories that feature traveling from the stars as consciousness are widespread and far older than the theory of evolution. That prehistoric people were indigenous and were intelligent, not primitive. That Indigenous intellectual development was focused on spiritual wisdom. That Indigenous spirituality existed before religions and contained the original instructions. These beliefs were more holistic, pragmatic, and universal. Guiding spiritual principles involved treating one another with respect and being stewards of creation. Teach that spirit is real and has actual impacts. And Indigenous people communed with nature through ceremonies. That civilization has only been around for approximately 6,000 years, which is only the last 3% of the human experience of 200,000 years. And that it was an error for historians to begin interpreting human experience, commencing just with civilization. Historic Greeks and Romans should not be referred to as ancient, but rather as part of the recent past. Indigenous culture is oppressed because its values are not consistent with those of civilization. And Indigenous societies are better described as equalizations, as they were nurturing rather than self-absorbed and violent like civilizations. Current curriculum on Indigenous spirituality can be characterized as superficial. Most emphasis is on traditional ecological knowledge. The idea that Indigenous culture and beliefs had a close relationship with nature and that Indigenous people knew the intricacies of how animals behaved and what plants could be used for medicinal purposes. Elders are brought in to share stories and legends. What the curriculum lacks is a deeper explanation of the basics of Indigenous beliefs and how spirituality informs our thought, attitudes, and life in general. Deeper wisdom was traditionally passed on through stories and ceremonies that produced insights that are substantially different from that of mainstream education. Perhaps most importantly, these traditional approaches instilled a sense of awe, reverence, and respect for creation, rather than teaching analytical and technical skills that is wrongly believed to enable us to control and manage the world. Just a couple more things. Everybody talks about civilization, and the assumption always is that even Indigenous cultures would eventually, become like civilization. In other words, selfish, greedy, damaging to nature, all that kind of thing. But clearly, the thinking of Indigenous people is different. We have a totally different attitude towards how we should behave, and a totally different value system. And so I had to create a word that was a counterpoint to civilization. So I created the word equalization, which kind of puts us, so to speak, in balance with everything else. So I often say, we are in a civilizational box, right? We're kind of in that box, except for those of us who still retain our Indigenous values, right? We're not, while we have to live in this kind of society, we can still see beyond that box, right? We can still see outside that box. So, what's my time like here?
Oh, you're good.
Good?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well, I'll keep on. So there's, I know I used to talk to Mush and Danny about, the state of the world, right? And like how bad things are becoming and whether there's hope or not. He used to tell me, he said, he says that, because I think he was pessimistic about the future, but he'd say, he'd say the critter lost his children. And I got into a thing about this thing called Star Stories. I know I was talking to Rita here and some other people about Star Stories. And, Bush and Danny told me, he says the name of our people, the Anishinaabe, which is the parent culture of the solar. He said, he says, meaning of that word, the deeper meaning is, people have been lowered down to the earth, and, coming from the stars. And so, I used to think not too much of that. I thought, well, it's a story, right? But as I started doing more research on it, and one of the areas I was doing research on was reincarnation, and this idea that there's a well-documented a body of information which demonstrates that there are certain people who recall previous lives, like as children, right? They recall their previous lives, and these there's thousands of cases of these that are documented, and they've been researched and verified, through academic research methods and everything. And so, one of the things that tells you is there's something about consciousness that survives death, and not only survives death, but is reintroduced to somebody who was born. And of course, as Indigenous people, we believe in rebirth, right? We that's another one of our beliefs. And so, there are things like that, and other things that Mush and Dan used to tell me. He used to say, when we're born, he says, we choose these bodies. He says, and we enter these bodies, and he says, we're not these bodies. He says these are like vehicles, they're like clothes almost. He says, but we have to learn how to control them. And so, it was getting very interesting to me because, it's it sort of began to make me think about this whole account of people coming from the stars. Right, there are star stories all over the world among Indigenous people, and yet all we talk about these days is the theory of evolution, right? Which is that we're essentially, we essentially evolved from some kind of biological soup, right? We're advanced primates of some sort, right? But then sometimes I have to ask myself, well, why don't we take more seriously, like a story that's been around for 200,000 years, like why are we not listening to that, those stories which have been around for that long, and instead, just talking only about the theory of evolution. And to me, this whole thing about the star stories started to make more and more sense. And he would tell me, he says there are beings on other planets. He says, and one of the illustrations that can be used to think about that is that they say that there's more planets in the universe than there are grains of sand on the Earth, right? So think about that, right? Like, think about the Sahara Desert, for example, which is roughly the size of Canada. So if you covered all of Canada in 15 feet of 20 feet of sand, each of those grains of sand would represent a planet somewhere, right? And of course, we know that the stars spawn the basics of life all over, right? So here we are. You take your little piece of sand that's right in front of you, and you say, "This is my planet," right? It's the only one that's got life on it, right? And of course, if we appreciate life so much, right? Why aren't we, taking it more seriously and taking care of it and stuff, right? But basically, it made me wonder, why is it that our consciousness is so different from all the other consciousnesses that exist here on the Earth? if we evolve or everything else, why aren't we more in harmony, right? And so things like that. But the only reason I'm talking about that, some people, they seem to get very excited about that. They like that part of it. But I think the idea of that is to give us hope, right? That if we are fortunate, I know Mush and Danny, he says, he was quite, frank about it. He says, he thinks that, we could be leaving the planet, right? I think that's the reason why I put that in there. That's kind of like a distant future thing. So if we screw things up, there's still some hope about there. We can still have some hope to hang on to. Anyway, sorry for being so long-winded here. So please, if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to try and answer them. So we should ask questions, otherwise I'll start, one lecture noise.
Hi, my name is Justine. Just thinking about how can we impact change then? It just seems like it's impossible to change things. And what is the best solution going forward for our people?
Yeah, so I talk about that in the book too. As a matter of fact, near the end, I talk about that. And, I basically say that, first of all, it's essential for us to rediscover Indigenous wisdom. When you look at all the problems that exist in the world today, when you Google what should people do about it, right? There's usually two things that come up. One is, well, let's let artificial intelligence run everything for us, right? That's one thing. The other thing usually is like the apocalyptic vision of the future where everything's gonna fall apart and then somehow we're able to rebuild it, right? But what I see is there's a third option nobody ever talks about, and that's looking at the system that was always there before and still continues. As Indigenous people, we had a system that was successful, right? And so why isn't that being considered as a solution, right? But you see, it requires the undoing of a lot of the stuff that's been created, and that's the problem. How do you convince people who still think that, this is the end all and be all, right? And there's no other way. And, there's no underestimating it. It'll be an immense, if not impossible job to do that. Just to educate people and make people aware of what we're about and how we have potential solutions. The other thing, of course, is we're marginalized and we're powerless, right? And so, what I say is that it'll be essential for people who are allies, right? Non-Indigenous people who are allies, who understand what we're saying and who care about the future, right? Who care about the future of their, future generations and that type of thing, right? For them to ally with us because they occupy positions of power, right? And influence. And so, it's a long shot, but I mean, what else is there, right? Either you throw up your arms and you say it's hopeless, right? Or it's whatever, right? And so, that's one of the conclusions I came with this book. That is the way for for people to survive. And one of the things that I point out is that if you take a look at the nearest species, biological species that are nearest to us, like the primates, they're expected to exist on the earth for 1 million years. We've been around modern humans have been around for 200,000 years. So that just leaves like 800,000 years, right? Another 800,000 years. So how are we going to do that? Right? How are we going to do that? Another 800,000 years. People never talk about that, right? If they talk about 8 years, they're considered to be really far looking, but it is a real question, and I think people need to think about it. And we're so bound up in the system by just worrying about where we're going to get our next dollar, right? Or, where are we going to get our next meal, or, what do we have to do at our job tomorrow type thing, right? We don't have the time to really, you know, like this whole civilization thing has just swallowed us up. And, you know, you know, I also talk about, wheat ago, right? Wheat ago, the spirit of greed, right? And I said that, you know, as Indigenous people, we really thought that wheat ago wouldn't take over our lives, and we were pretty successful at it. But it's happened. And you know what our people said? They said, you know, if wheat ago gets loose, he's going to eat you up and is going to devour you completely. That's what they said. So it's yeah, interesting to think about. I'm not being too negative. Nobody's going to like that. But I mean, you know, these things need to be talked about. I mean, somebody was saying, well, you know, they're saying, no, you know, you're trying to take on the world. And I said, well, somebody should,
Yes.
right? You know, I mean, you know, these things need to be questioned. Nobody's really talking about it, right? Everybody's, you know, too busy watching Taylor Swift or the Super Bowl or whatever.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate this. It's very important to unpack the civilization has been quite mystical. And that we have to really take part and know that it is a discussion of focus on it and to recognize how so much intelligence, spirituality, knowledge that the rest of us aren't just people. Great deal of attention to learn from, listen, and we provide that space where we can thank you so much for the sense of
Yeah, thank you. Well, you know, there's this whole saying, civilizations are self-destructive. And why are they self-destructive? It's because they're based on greed. Right? You know, they're going to exploit the resources. They're going to fight each other, right? And inevitably, they run their course because they can't sustain it. And so you're kind of in a downward cycle. The damages are occurring more quickly than the remedies fix them. Whereas with Indigenous people, it was what I call a culture of life, because you were constantly nurturing the natural environment, right? You were constantly healing, right? Creating unity among peoples. And you know, we had the strategy to survive for 800,000 years. Right? You know, so, you know, I think people need to take it seriously. And the problem, of course, is that the dynamic of civilization has, you know, it's just so powerful, you know, and it's compelling in its own way, but you know, it is starting to unravel. I don't think there's any question about it. You know, 50 years ago, people wouldn't have taken something so seriously, but I think you know, I think people really need to take a look. And you know, when you take a look at the Americas, like, you know, a place like here was, I mean, this has only been colonized for what, 150 years or so. You know, people need to realize that it's not that long ago. Maybe there is hope, right? Maybe we can, you know, I mean, if you know, if it took centuries and even millennia to create civilization, maybe if we have that time, and if we have, you know, if we, you know, there's a strategy, we have the people who can take the levers of whatever government and education and all of these things. You know, there is actually a thing called the degrowth movement, which I was looking for. Well, is there anything happening? You know, and there is a thing called the degrowth movement, which is kind of taking hold. And what it basically talks about is kind of slowly undoing a lot of the stuff, like the technological things and all that kind of stuff, the economic, all these other, like the economic engine and that kind of thing. But you know, there's one glaring thing that's missing in that degrowth movement. Spirituality. There's no spiritual basis there. They're simply talking off the top of their head as so-called rational people, right? But you can't convince rational people. Somebody's going to come up with another thing and say, oh, like you degrowth people are full of BS, right? And it's actually because they're one of the things that degrowth people don't talk about is population and the need to reduce population. So it's more in harmony with the natural world, right? And so these are things I think that could potentially be achieved by, some people call it re-indigenization, which is when you have reconciliation. But I mean, those are baby steps, right? If people really want to talk about reconciliation, they need to talk about a really big program of radical, extensive change. So people in many ways, they don't have a clue what reconciliation means. Yeah.
So maybe further to that. What kinds of things might you suggest? That's some starting.
Well, people ask me that, and I sometimes tell them, well, apart from, for example, your attitude towards nature, right, or your attitude towards Indigenous people, or even towards money and their job and stuff that, I usually say, well, you could have a bit more humility. You could have a bit more honesty, right? Because we're kind of like in the post-truth era. We're kind of like in the post, all of those values that talk about like honesty and humility and generosity and love and, respect. We're kind of like in the post of all of those things, and so, I mean, as individuals, it's, we, individuals try to do stuff, but I mean, it's, it takes much more than that, right? Yeah.
So I guess what I'm asking is at a more collective, almost not institutional, but, for example, within education, because you did refer to that change in educational institutions. Like you mentioned, with some teachers, would that be part of curriculum? These are all frame terms. Would that be part of what teaching that you might? How would that teaching look? Like we're sitting here. This, how would this look like teaching for students, young students, and stuff like that? Because those are precious.
Yeah, well, that is occurring.
Yeah, and then how might we go about?
Well, I propose something more radical.
Come on.
Okay, those guys in the United Nations, all these presidents of countries and stuff that meet at the United Nations. You know what I do? I take them for 4 days, put them in a sweat lodge. Put them in a sweat lodge. Let them pray for 4 days in a sweat lodge. And then let them come out and listen to Indigenous elders talk about where did we come from, who were the first people, what were our teachings, right? All of these things. Make them go through that and then let them make a decision. Right? Because I mean, right now all they do is they come to these meetings and they're big jets with saying, well, I've got $300 million, I'll give it to this guy, and let's sign this peace treaty so you don't shoot your missiles at us first, and so on and so forth, right? That's not a way to run a world, right? But I mean, who wanted to say that, right? Since when is that going to happen?
But so that's not going to happen. What can we do tomorrow morning? Can we take a students? Can we take those to school lunch? and to which
Well, I know that some teachers, I've heard of teachers who do sweat lodges as part of like their around like the grade 8, grade 9 type of thing, because that's when it was traditionally done, young people, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the elders say, you know, you don't really start their spiritual journey until you do something like that, right? And so, I mean, yeah, that's, you know, but I mean, yeah, it's a giant challenge. I don't think I have, you know, like this is this is going to be a long-term project, and I think you know it's going to be you know many small steps, and you know I'm just hoping I can sell enough books, you know, that people will maybe get the message. So you can say, you know, go buy Blair's books.
Good announcement.
Last 5 minutes asking nothing more burning questions. I'm going to start talking. Yeah, I'll talk big ones. I kind of have, I'm on this alien thing right now. You know, like one of the things that really bugs me is that show called Ancient Aliens. I know you've seen that on TV, right? It says that, you know, sometime in the distant past, aliens came here in physical spaceships and did something to us that kind of put us on our current path and made us so smart, right? But you know, like I was saying, everything that that I've heard talking about, you know, like saying that our people came from the stars, saying that we're spirit beings, right? And we came and occupied these bodies which were here, they've been evolving, right? And we saw these as useful vehicles for our experience, to learn. And you know, what that tells me is we don't have to worry about aliens. We're the aliens, right? It's like Toys R Us. Aliens are us, right? Aliens are us. We're the aliens, right? That's why we don't fit in. That's why you don't have to worry about aliens coming here and exploiting everything. We're already taking care of that job, right? So, yeah, and so I mean, that's to me, that's what the Mushin Danny was talking about. He says, take a look at these guys that are creating rocket ships. He says, it tells you that we have the conscious ability. He says, we won't be traveling in physical spaceships. He says, but he says, we can create spaceships of consciousness. He says that we can travel. He says, we'll travel and find a new one. He says, so, you know, I mean, if ancient aliens, if they can spend millions of dollars putting together these ancient alien shows, why can't they put together a series talking about Indigenous teachings, right? You know, and maybe think a bit differently about things, right? Because you know that's part of the problem is we're confined in this box, we're confined in this mental box and can't think outside. And that's I'm trying to challenge people with this by saying, you know, you can think about things differently. And you can think about it because all of these things are based in Indigenous stories, right? And you know, like I mean, you know, like the elders shared a lot with me, and they said you can, you know, you can write about this, you know, and so that's what I'm doing. And like I say, this isn't something that's any particular brilliance of mine. It's basically all of this is based on you know what the elders have told me, you know, and so you know you know I you know take it seriously. Is that about it? Is it? Well, thank you very much for coming out, and don't forget. Yeah, the books are all